Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead of Tablet, the Wall Street Journal, Hudson Institute, and the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. In modern presidential politics, the gender gap has never been wider, but it gets particularly large when you break out gender by educational attainment. According to a recent poll by Pew Research, the gender gap is 17 points, with Donald Trump ahead 8 points among men and Kamala Harris up 9 points among women. The gap by education is 29 points, with Trump ahead 10 points among people without a college degree and Harris ahead 19 points among those with one. But broken up by gender and education, we see that the gaps are driven particularly by men without a college degree and women with a college degree, with an overall difference of 43 points. We are truly looking at two different Americas when we dig into the views of non-college educated men and college educated women, according to the New York Times. They are at opposite ends of the spectrum politically and experience essentially separate economies, and therefore give priority to totally distinct sets of character traits and issues. Walter, maybe not breaking news by this point, but in the grand scheme of things, is this news or faux news?
You know, it's not as new as people think. In some ways, yeah, the gender gap may be bigger now, but the idea that sort of blue-collar men without college degrees and upper-middle-class college-educated women didn't particularly see eye to eye. I don't know that actually comes as a big shock and a surprise. Certainly when I was a kid, you'd have all these blue-collar construction workers on their lunch break in New York doing wolf whistles as like Wall Street yuppies sashayed by in all of their good looks, and you felt like there was an unreciprocated desire on the part of the blue-collar men, and the women really did not appreciate this show of male interest, the male gaze. So, and you can go back earlier. I think of American literature, Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, where you see sort of at one end of the scale is the widow Douglas, the educated, well-to-do woman who is all about civilization and standards. And then there's Huck Finn's father lying in the gutter, complaining about how the government won't even let you do what you want to your own kids, and rah, 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 right? So this is not really all that new. I think one of the things that is different is that people are trapped together in the same society more than they were. I mean, you go back to the frontier days, and a lot of those non-college educated men just headed west and did what they did, and the school marms stayed east and only came out much later. And the gold rush, again, the uneducated men are out there panning for gold in San Francisco, in California and Alaska. It's a little harder to do now. In some ways, the surveillance state, the fact that, again, in 1830, there weren't really credit agencies. You just moved 50 miles and had a new life. Now, this controlling sense of always being watched, having your credit history stretch back to when you were 18. I think a lot of the blue collar men are more resentful of a society that in some ways stresses conformity to upper middle class norms, non-gendered upper middle class norms. But you can't you can't have a wife in 6 different states. You can't walk away from gambling debts across the river into a new territory or whatever. And so I think on the one hand, you've got a lot of men that are chafing at the restraints that society imposes more than before, because it's imposing more restraints. And for them, America is, I don't know if you remember the novel or the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey, but Nurse Ratched as the avenging female power that was controlling all of these guys locked up in an institution, and the desperate hunger for the guys to get out. In that book, Nurse Ratched was the villain and the guys are the hero. But in the books in Nurse Ratched's view, she was just trying to bring order to a bunch of deplorables. And so yeah, this is a I think this is one of those conflicts. To some degree, it's in human nature, but to some degree in America, it comes out more because we're a country that historically has given everybody a lot more reign to be themselves. And now there's less freedom, particularly I think for working class men.
Presumably, there are some issues in America of concern to both non-college educated men and highly educated women, like, other things we've talked about on the podcast, like housing prices and healthcare costs and crime and such. Is there the potential for a future ambitious political candidate to grab both cohorts on these issues, or do you think they'll remain stratified for a while on more immediately salient status issues like the ones you named?
Look, I actually think in some ways their economic interests are a little bit different too. For example, on in car insurance, young men pay much higher rates on car insurance than young women do, or anybody else does, because they have more accidents. But on the other hand, when it comes to health insurance, we make everybody pay something much closer to the fair rate because even though middle-aged women call on medical care a lot more than 20-something men do, why it wouldn't be right to make those, force those women to pay more. So they're in some ways the economic interests are actually not aligned. And certainly in general, it's tricky to try to align the economic interests of college educated people and non-college educated people in this country.
All right, our second story. Since Donald Trump hit China with punitive tariffs in 2018, his push to cut the trade deficit was snowballed into a full-scale bipartisan effort to stop China from becoming the world's biggest economy and obtaining technology that threatens American military superiority. At a glance, the campaign appears successful. China's economy is no longer on pace to overtake the US and is actually falling further behind. But despite more than 6 years of U.S. tariffs, export controls, and financial sanctions, Xi Jinping is making steady progress in positioning China to dominate industries of the future. New research by Bloomberg suggests that China's industrial policy blueprint, unveiled a decade ago to make the nation a leader in 13 key emerging technologies, has largely been a success, with China achieving a global leadership position in 5 of them and catching up fast in 7 others. This means the world outside the U.S. is increasingly driving Chinese electric vehicles, scrolling the web on Chinese smartphones, powering their homes with Chinese solar panels, and flying Chinese drones. Walter, is this news or faux news?
News. In one sense, you could say that a lot of American foreign policy looks like this. A lot of noise, a lot of drama, not totally without impact, but in the end, not achieving the desired result. I mean, I look at, say, the Biden administration's Ukraine policy, massive diplomatic, financial efforts, successful in creating a huge coalition that, there's only one little tiny thing it isn't doing, beating Russia. So to some degree, you can look at our Middle East policies sort of the same way. A lot of investment, a lot of noise, a lot of declaratory statements, but actually not the desired impact on the real world. And I think our China policy, to some degree, has the same sort of contrast between high visibility, low results, theatrical policy to some degree. Now, honestly, it's not a bad thing that China is making great electric cars and making great solar panels. I mean, I can't really object to this, and I don't object to this. But I think to some degree they continue to try to build their global market position on the basis of subsidies and policies that ought to be illegal. Whether they are or not depends on a reading of the World Trade Organization rules and regulations that I'm afraid I just somehow never seem to be able to get around to. I think it's there in volume 812 somewhere. I just haven't found it in Appendix C. But I think we're American foreign policy sooner or later is going to get more serious because we're continuing to kind of exhaust the margin of safety, the very large margin of safety that we inherited from the end of the Cold War. And we're just, we are sort of dissolute heirs spending down a trust fund of, people used to have a lot more confidence in us. in our wisdom. We used to have a much stronger sense of national purpose. We used to be much more serious about making sure that we had the defense capabilities to deal with the problems that seemed that we might likely face them soon. We sort of thrown all that away. And so we find ourselves faced with contingencies that are more complex and more difficult than the immediate tools that we have in hand to try to deal with them. So big problem, lots of it. Not all Trump's fault, but he's not exempt either.
As the Bloomberg report noted, the Biden administration largely kept the Trump-era economic and trade strategy in place with regard to China. Would you expect a Harris administration to do the same or to do something new, or is this all going to be determined by external events?
Well, of course, it will all be determined by events, but the trajectory would be for not a lot of change. The American consensus to do something about China is strong. Tariffs remain what people think of as something. So therefore, let's do this.
All right, final story of the week. Kamala Harris was forced to distance herself from President Biden in the final week of the campaign after he dismissed Donald Trump supporters as, quote, garbage. The vice president, campaigning with only a few days to go until polling day, was put on the back foot by Biden's gaffe, which overshadowed her rally in Washington this week. On a Zoom call with Latino voters, Biden had said, quote, Donald Trump has no character. He doesn't give a damn about the Latino community. Just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. Close quote. Walter, was this quasi-October surprise news or faux news?
Oh, please. Total faux news. Just the capacity of the American political process to obsess about trifles. In the first place, anybody who's been following the career of Donald Trump should be very far past the idea that calling people mean names on campaign platforms is some sort of, sin against the Holy Ghost. It's I hate to say, this is business as usual. And it's utterly disingenuous for Trump's supporters to act, oh, I'm so wounded. I'm a person of such delicate sensibilities, and I've been so deeply wounded. On the other hand, it was a sign of Trump's typical political genius that when his campaign was facing its own little October surprise with this garbage comment, which was truly poorly advised, poorly taken, for him to jump in the garbage truck and sort of flip the narrative, this just reminds us of why, in spite of everything, Trump is the most formidable single political figure in the United States right now. He has a genius and a willingness to step out of the box, whether it's in the McDonald's fries with that, or whether it's in the garbage truck driving business. He is just a better politician than his opponents.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. We're recording this on Thursday afternoon, Walter, but you have a blockbuster essay coming out in Monday's edition of Tablet. The piece will go live on the site sometime Sunday evening, so I encourage all of our listeners to go check it out then and share it. And it's on the crisis of leadership in America, and that regardless of what happens at the ballot box on Tuesday, or however many days it is until all the votes are counted, that we've been suffering under a kind of comprehensive failure of leadership across basically all levels of national life for a generation now, and that this is partly driven by technological change that is more or less out of our control, but is also significantly driven by decisions we've made about how elites relate to, quote, ordinary people, and also how they educate their own children, who are mostly the ones destined for positions of national leadership. So give us a preview. Talk us through your thoughts here that readers can look forward to reading about in more detail in a few days.
I think the first thing that struck me and kind of got me thinking about writing this essay was just looking at all of these polls that show collapsing confidence in various institutions in American life. And this is one of the few things that Trump voters and Harris voters seem to share in common is growing distrust in political leaders, in business, in media, obviously in Congress. That's not really particularly new, but the leaderships in different professions, even. So, medical and public health profession, we see all the anti-vax stuff. And you might think, and there's a tendency, I think, among many of us when we read these statistics, think, oh, it's so terrible how social media are eroding trust in a perfectly good leadership class. It reminds me a little bit of that moment in, gosh, which was it? Is a mad, mad, mad world where somebody comes rushing in and says to the king, "Sire, the people are revolting." "They certainly are," says the king. Or the moment in that Bertolt Brecht writes about where the East German government, the people have lost the confidence of the government, and it needs to, create a new people. Yeah, I think we have to look at this as real and say, the American people haven't suddenly become a lot more stupid than they've been, or even more cynical. But actually, we can look around, why, oh, why might someone have lost faith in military leadership? Gee, let's see, Iraq war, Afghan war. Gosh, I don't know. I can't think of any possible reason. Or political leadership. Free trade with China is going to make China democratic and us rich. Or military and political leadership saying, it doesn't matter that every year China is getting stronger and stronger around Taiwan and our position is getting weaker. Let's not worry about that. Let's think about happy thoughts. Let's work on making our Defense Department's energy supply greener. And isn't there something more we can do about making trans people comfortable in the military? Let's get something done. But in the same way, people's experience of insurance companies, of HMOs, there are all of these points of contact where people contact powerful institutions. And you get the feeling as you look at this stuff that we have two problems. One is elites are not always making good decisions. For example, look back at COVID and the closures, unnecessary closures, as it turned out, of schools and businesses and so on, that did really immense damage, sometimes destroyed businesses that people had spent a lifetime building and left a whole cohort of kids, with all kinds of educational and social adjustment problems. But we haven't seen much of a reckoning. Not many people have been fired because of this or in any way sort of expressed contrition. So there's the sense among a lot of people that elites are not good at their job. And even, by the way, when they are good at their job, even when they're right, they're not very good at persuading people to take their advice. I personally, for example, am of the belief that while tariffs, we have a certain need for some tariffs in connection with national security policy, supply chain security, and so on vis-a-vis China. On the whole, tariffs are a cost, and one should try to minimize them in some ways, and they won't actually make manufacturing employment come back. But the American elite, most of which agrees with the sentiments that I just expressed, is completely unable to make a convincing case to the people at large about why this is true, in part because they've made so many bad decisions in the past, in part because their control of rhetoric is so poor. I remember once listening to a very, very prominent Democrat give an impassioned speech about inequality, how we have to get rid of it, and then turn without really taking a breath to say, and oh, by the way, I'm really proud to announce that my daughter has this great new job, which the mom had given to her, frankly. So, without any awareness of how this would look to somebody whose daughter wasn't going to get a really prestigious job. So I began to ask myself, all right, the elites are cut off and they're bad at what they do. And this is not just a problem of the media. It's not just a problem of politicians. It's not just here or there. It's a general social problem. Well, how do you wrap your head around that? And that's where I'm going with these essays.
One of the points I thought was interesting in the piece that publishes on Monday was that, when you have an elite in a country like England or France, one of the distinctive qualities of them is that there just aren't that many of them. But in America, you have something like 50 million people with an income of over $1 million. And the ways in which this kind of maybe distorts our idea of what an elite is or what its function is or their self-image. Can you talk a little more about that?
Well, that'd be net worth, not income. I wish we were in a country where 50 million people had an income of over a million, and I would love to be one of them. But it used to be 100, 150 years ago that we had a real elite, an economic edge. Something like 1% or less of the population went to college. A lot of people were working in sweatshops and so on, and a handful of people were living on beautiful country estates and so on and so forth. But that elite always knew that it was a small minority, and it also knew that its ability to hold on to its position depended to a certain degree on its ability to work with the huge majority that otherwise might do to them what happened to the French aristocrats in the French War, in the French Revolution. But I think now, you think about kids who grow up in an upper middle class suburb, attending schools where almost all the other kids come from that same stratum of society. Then they go to colleges where just about everybody again comes from the same stratum, except for like a few clearly marked diversity kids. And then everybody in grad school, and all of the incentives are pointing you to telling you that the way to get ahead in life is to learn how to please and talk to and flatter your superiors in this elite. And that was, again, 100 years ago, or even 75 years ago. If you wanted a good career after World War II, it really helped to have had a good military career. Well, a lot of that was involved in like getting people, most of whom would have not been from the elite, to follow you in a charge up a hill, to establish trust, to be able to communicate, to understand the people who came from a totally different background. I know you served in the military, and I think had some very helpful lessons along this line, some of which may have been a little difficult to process. And in the same way, in a factory, if you were in management in a company, you'd be dealing with a very, very powerful union, and you would need to be able to figure out how to persuade the union guy who could shut your whole company down and wreck your prospects. Like, how do you bargain with him? How do you understand what he wants? How do you figure out what the common ground is between your agenda and their agenda and make it go? Even, by the way, in terms of selling, entertainment products and consumer products, the mass market was where all the money was. So you might be the most hoity-toity, high-flying Hollywood literary writer in the world, but if you wanted a successful career in Hollywood, it had to appeal to the folks out there. And that meant, your ability to understand them, your areas of commonality with them, that was the foundation of your elite success. Increasingly, none of that is true. And increasingly, it's almost a liability in elite circles. If you are the person who realizes that almost every American of Hispanic origin thinks that Latinx, or however you pronounce it, is just some horrible, stupid thing, okay, it's more important that you understand you should shut up about it in an elite circle than it is that you understand that doing this is going to torpedo whatever agenda these people are trying to cook up. Going along with the elite consensus has become, for a lot of people, a lot of important people, more important than going along or even coming to terms with the consensus that exists outside the bubble, or the various consensuses. People aren't all the same. So as this gap widens, our leadership is less and less able to communicate, but also even less and less able to understand what people want, and therefore to think about policies and ideas that would do what most people would think of as working. I think there's another aspect of it too, which I've seen in my lifetime, which is because we had a huge expansion of the American upper middle class after World War II, huge expansion of the people who went to college, the professions became much larger, all of these things. You would have a lot of people from blue collar backgrounds who would be sort of first generation college, first generation professionals. And these folks knew where they came from. And not only that, every family reunion was like the one brother who went to college and then the three sisters and two brothers who hadn't gone to college or whatever. And when you went to hang out with your cousins, you would be hanging, not all of your cousins would either be going to college or have gone to college or have parents who did. You had a different life. There are all kinds of ways that our society used to teach us to get along with each other and understand each other that it doesn't now. And it puts a bigger burden on schools in a way, or the educational system, to try to, in a sense, give people what their background isn't naturally giving them. Oh, and by the way, it makes mobility harder, all of this, because the kid coming from outside the bubble who wants to get in and move up has to learn this arcane jargon and all of this, attitudes and in tones of voice and, like what to go, what to really like and what to say is cringe and on and on and on and on. And there's just more of that knowledge out there. And the penalties can be pretty savage for people who miss it. So the bubble keeps getting thicker, and to some degree, it's in the interest of the people already inside to keep thickening the bubble. So I think we've got a problem on our hands. And our educational institutions, instead of being places that take a lead in attacking this, are very often unintentionally at times responsible for making it worse. So frankly, the more time you spend in elite American higher ed institutions, the less capable you are of understanding what Americans think who don't go to those institutions and being able to communicate effectively with the people who did.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. I don't think I have a choice this week, Walter. I'd be derelict in my duties to our faithful listeners if I didn't ask you who your pick is. Not your preference, but who your bet would be for who's going to win on Tuesday.
I'm afraid I'm where pretty much all of our listeners are. I cannot see any strong evidence that leads me to the conclusion that one of the two is a clear favorite. I do think that Harris probably has had a bit more momentum in the last couple of days than she had in the week or so before. Whether, what that does, I don't know. And I think ultimately things are going to depend on, how many voters and what kind of voters decide to vote in Michigan and Pennsylvania and so on. I see even in Michigan, I see some polls that show Harris up 5 and some polls that show the state tied. Well, I mean, I don't want to depress any of our viewers by confessing my fallibility on the podcast, but I don't know which of those polls is better, if either is better. They may both be wrong for completely different reasons. So I'm afraid we're just going to have to watch and see what happens. To some degree, I would say that's a good sign about the vitality of American democracy. That here, with all of the social science in the world, all the people picking over the entrails of the public, all of the social media evidence and Google search evidence and prediction markets and everything else you can look at, ultimately, until the American people speak, we do not know what they're going to say.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.